Hello, it's Roger, author of the Azure Sandbox, and we're continuing our code walkthroughs of the VNet shared configuration. And this time we're going to focus on the Terraform resources in the project. Remember when we did our deployment, 29 individual resources were deployed. So the first thing we're going to look at here is log analytics. So that is this configuration file. Let me bump up the font here, make this a little bit easier to see. Okay, so the first thing I do in this configuration is generate a random ID that we're going to use for the workspace name, and then I provision the workspace. Pretty straightforward stuff. And then the workspace itself, I output two variables, the name of the workspace, the ID of the workspace, and then I also provision a secret in Key Vault for the shared key for that workspace. Okay, so we saw that value previously when we did our smoke testing. So that's the log analytics workspace. I think the documentation here points out that you use log analytics for things like Azure Monitor and Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Basically, any place, any Azure service that needs to log data, you can log it to log analytics. All right, let's move on and talk about the Azure automation account. We did kind of talk about this in the previous videos, but let's have a look at it. So the automation, the configuration for the automation account is pretty straightforward. We generate a random name, and then we provision the automation account itself. That's pretty straightforward. Where the fancy stuff happens is here with the provisioner, where we configure the automation account. And I'm just going to quick pause and we'll be right back with you. Okay, so let's have a look at the provisioning script. This code that we generate here is just a parameters block where we pass all our parameters to this PowerShell script called configureautomation.ps1. So let's have a look at that PowerShell script. Just get to the mains, kind of give you an idea of the flow. Okay, so the first thing we do in the script is we log into Azure using the service principal, and then we set up the default subscription. We go and grab the automation account, and then we update some desired state configuration modules that we're going to use in our configuration. And those include this PS-DSC resources module that's common for all Azure Automation DSC configurations. And also this XDSC domain join, that's a bare bones module to domain join VMs. So we'll just make sure that those two are running the most recent versions. And then we import a new module called Active Directory DSC, and that we're going to use to configure our Active Directory Domain Services domain controller. So those are the three modules required. Then we set up some variables. So as we, the configurations themselves reference variables, and so those variables need to be created in Azure Automation. So we have one for the Azure Active Directory tenant ID, another for the subscription ID, another for the resource group name, and another with the name of the automation account itself, and then finally the name of the domain, which is mysandbox.local by default. So once we have those variables in our automation account, we can refer to those variables from within a DSC configuration. We also create a few different credentials Bootstrap admin, that gets used for the local admin account on Windows VMs, Windows Server VMs. And then we have both domain admin and domain admin short. It's basically two different formats. Sometimes Windows can be picky about the format of how you specify an account. So you could see this first format is just domain / username, and this second one pulls out the .local and adds the username at the end of it. I discovered that two different sets of credentials are required if you're using a local domain. Then the real meat of what we use Azure Automation for, first we import a configuration called lab-domain-config.ps1, and then we compile it for ADDS1, which is our Active Directory Domain Services virtual machine. So if we look at this lab-domain-config.ps1, this is the actual DSC configuration for configuring our domain controller. You can see the two modules that are referenced here, and then the credentials that we use. We're pulling those from the automation account. And here we enable the AD domain services feature on the VM, and then we configure the domain itself. Okay, which again is my sandbox.local, by default. So that is it for the automation account and the use of desired state configuration. Just trying to see if there's anything else from the docs that we want to point out here. Yeah, I think we covered most of this. Great. So let's move on to a discussion of the network resources. So this network configuration includes a bunch of local variables, and then it also is used to provision the virtual network, all the subnets, all the network security groups, all the network security group associations with subnets, and then all the rules for those network security groups. And we also use it to configure Azure Bastion, right? So the technique that I'm using here, the virtual network is pretty straightforward. This is the code to configure the virtual network. You can see here where we're configuring the DNS server properties of the virtual network. This first one is going to be the IP address of our Active Directory Domain Services domain controller, which also functions as a DNS server. And then the second is the special IP address associated with Azure DNS. So if we can't resolve a DNS query with our manually implemented DNS server, then the VNet will forward that traffic off to Azure to verify or to resolve that DNS query. We output some variables for that VNet, and there's our VNet. For the subnets, I do something a little bit more slick here. I have one resource definition for all of the subnets instead of having a separate resource for each subnet. So that's where those local variables come in above. I just basically loop through my local.subnets variable, and I create a subnet for each one. And then I also create a network security group for each subnet. And then I create an association between that network security group and each individual subnet. Finally, I use local variables to create rules for my network security groups and bind them to the appropriate network security group. So if you go up here and look at locals, you can look at the techniques that I used. Basically the approach I used was a little bit more complexity, but fewer lines of code, right? So I have one local variable to define all my subnets, and then each subnet defines the NSG rules that I want bound to that subnet. I have a separate collection of NSG rules, which defines each one that gets referenced above. And then here's where I flatten out for each subnet which network security rules apply to each subnet, and I create a separate variable for that. So that's the VNet, the subnets, and the network security groups. The Bastion code is pretty straightforward. We create a random ID for the Bastion host name. And then here's where we provision the Bastion host. We also need a public IP address for that Bastion host, and the code for that is here. So that's just a quick code walkthrough of the networking code. And I think the last bit in the docs is talking through the domain controller VM. So it has a NIC and it has an OS disk associated with it. So we're running Windows Server 2022 Data Center Core. We're using platform orchestrated patching, and we configure the local admin and local admin password using our secrets. We make sure that we don't try to create the VM before our automation account is fully configured, so we use a dependency for that. And we register it using a provisioner with Azure Automation desired state configuration. So let's go look at the code. So here's the resource definition for my VM. There's no data disk, so this is a pretty simple VM. You can see here where we're grabbing secrets from Key Vault to configure the username and the password for the local admin account, right? Here's where we enable platform orchestrated patching. Here's all of our image properties, which type of Windows Server, what version of Windows Server we want to use. And then here's the provisioner. And this provisioner is a PowerShell script called aadsc register node.ps1. So as soon as the VM's available, this provisioner script runs. And what it does is pretty straightforward. It goes in, logs into Azure, and it basically runs this register DSC node routine, which registers the VM with Azure Automation desired state configuration, and it applies that configuration that we compiled previously, which, again, results in reboots and things, so it takes some time for those configurations to fully apply. Yeah, and then there are some output variables that are spit out by this configuration that get persisted in the state file, and we can use these from other configurations to drive automation where those other configurations depend upon this one. So I just define all of those. So that's it for the code walkthrough. Next, we're going to move on to our next configuration, which is VNet app. Thanks.